In this section, we're going to talk about if statements. And an if is a selection statement that runs a certain piece of code if some Boolean expression is true. We're going to also look at some flow charts. So the flow chart for a decision structure or a Boolean expression is a diamond shape. When we're talking about flow of our program in a flow chart, it goes from one statement to another generally. But when we get to a diamond, we have to make a decision. And that decision is a Boolean expression that can either be true or false. So the way an if statement works, if the expression inside the parentheses, we'll see it in a second. If that evaluates to true, we're going to run some statements. If it's false, we're going to skip those statements. So let's look at an example over here that's based on an example from the last chapter where we were calculating the area of a circle, I believe. So we're going to do a check. And the question is here, what would happen if somebody put in -3 for the radius of a circle? We don't really want negative radii for our circles. We only want to do positive numbers. So we can do a check before we do the calculation. So here is the if statement, if, and then we have a set of parentheses. Okay, so over here, if followed by a set of parentheses, and inside the parentheses comes some type of Boolean expression. And our Boolean expression here, Boolean expression is to check to see if the radius is greater than or equal to 0. If it is, then we're going to run whatever statements occur in the block that follows the if. So if followed by in parentheses, some kind of Boolean expression, and then we have a set of curly braces that indicates a block of statements that will run if that Boolean expression was true. So if the radius was greater than 0, then we're going to calculate the area, radius times pi, assign it to radius, and then we're going to print out the area for the circle of radius, and that's just like the last problem, the last example in the chapter before. It actually prints out the area of the circle using a system.out statement. So these two statements, the calculation of the area and the system.out.println, are both contained in this block that follows the if statement, and this block will only run if the radius was greater than or equal to 0. If the radius is less than 0, it's going to skip this entire block of code, and it won't do anything. Let's take a look at some common errors that you might make. All right, so the first one, if I is greater than 0, we forgot the parentheses. So that's incorrect. It won't work. The condition needs to be inside a set of parentheses. Okay, so this is the correct way over here. If I is greater than 0, then we want to print out that I is positive. The one down here says equivalent. So it's going to tell you that these two statements are equivalent. And technically they are. So we have an if statement. We have a set of parentheses. We're checking to see if I is greater than 0. And if it is, we're going to execute this block of code between the two curly braces. And it's going to print out system.out.println, I is positive. That's fine. That's all swell and dandy. But over here, it says this is equivalent. If I is greater than 0, then we're going to do system.out.println, I is positive. And what's different about these two? The difference is this one doesn't have curly braces. Now, here's the rub on this one. You don't have to have the curly braces. If you don't have the curly braces, an if statement will automatically decide whether or not it's going to execute this line or skip to the line after it. So in a simple example like this, this is equivalent and it works just fine leaving the curly braces out. But here's the error, and this can be a real tough one to find if you do it. So if you write it without the curly braces, and later on you come in here and you want to add a second line that does something, and you just go ahead and add the second line, and forget about the curly braces. The second line will run every single time, because without curly braces, it only considers the first line to be part of the if statement. All right? And that can create a bug that will drive you nuts for a long time, especially for new programmers. So my suggestion, and I would say most people teaching newer programmers would say the same thing, even if there's only going to be one line of code right now, always use your curly braces. Always put the block in case later on the code gets edited so you don't accidentally introduce a bug. Okay, so it's okay technically to leave the curly braces out for a single line that's going to execute as part of an if, but it's not the best way, especially for newer programmers. Use the curly braces. All right, so let's look at a demo program here. This is a little demo program that asks the user to enter an integer. If the number is a multiple of 5, it's going to tell them high 5. If the number is divisible by 2, it's going to say high even. And if it's divisible by both numbers, it's going to tell them both numbers, high 5 and high even. So let's take a look at the code. So we're using a scanner again. We keep using that same scanner statement over and over and over to set up an input scanner. Okay, and we ask the user to please enter an integer. And so then we access our scanner named input, and we say, get me the next integer, and we assign it to this value number. So the user's value gets stored in this variable number, and then we're using the modulus operator. If the number divisible by 5 equals 0, okay, that means there's no remainder after dividing it by 5. That means it's a number that's evenly divisible by 5. We're going to print out high 5. If the number modulus 2 comes out with a remainder of 0, we're going to print out high even. And notice they didn't use the curly braces on their blocks here. So we'll go ahead and run it. So let's do this. Enter an integer. I'm going to say 8. Okay, so 8 was not evenly divisible by 5, so it did not print high 5. But 8 modulus 2 does equal 0. There's no remainder when we divide by 2, so it prints out high even. If I print out 10, I get both because it's divisible by 5 and it's even. And of course, if I do 15, which is divisible by 5, I only get high 5. I don't get high even. So if I decide I want to change my program a little bit, and I want to add a statement if they get a high 5, and I say up high. So I want to say high 5 and I say up high. Okay. Now my editor is kind of smart here. It's kind of warning me, confusing indentation. Why did you indent this? Because it's not really part of that if statement. Why isn't it part of that if statement? Because there's no code block. We didn't use curly brace here. So I want to show you what happens if somebody comes back and adds that extra line. So the idea is this gets printed out only if the number is divisible by 5. And since I added another line, I'm kind of assuming as a new programmer that this will only get printed if the number is divisible by 5 as well. So let's go ahead and run it. And I'm going to put in 8 again. And it says up high. Okay, and you'll be asking yourself, why did it print out up high when that number was not divisible by 5? And it's because when we add the second line, we need to put some curly braces. Okay, that's why it's better just to have them from the beginning so you don't accidentally make that mistake. And now if I do 8, it only says high even. It doesn't tell me the up high part.